All right, hello and welcome to Module 102.2, where we talk a little bit about boot managers. Now, historically, the GRUB, the Grand Unified Bootloader, was Linux default bootloader. GRUB 2 came along a little bit later and was a replacement with some nice new features. So we'll talk about both of these a little bit and see some of their configuration steps. And we'll also review some of the commands that are needed in order to make changes to the bootloader configuration so that you can have multiple kernels to choose from and do some other customizations. Now, when you're booting a Linux system, you might want to specify alternate boot locations. You can do this by creating a bootable image on a thumb drive. So using the dd command as we see here, you can actually transfer the ISO image to a thumb drive and then boot from that once the system is reset. That's a nice way to have a portable method of building new systems out on the floor and that kind of thing. But it's also nice because you can have alternate boot images that you want to select from when you're doing different kinds of troubleshooting and so on. Once I've got more than one kernel configured, I can then choose them from the GRUB menu, and we'll see a little bit more details on how that's set up here shortly. But this again is another nice feature. If I build a new kernel and I want to test some settings, for instance, I can configure GRUB to have that available to me as an alternate choice when I boot. This way, if the new kernel doesn't work, I can always revert to the previous one and get back to a operable system. Now, you should know a little bit about legacy GRUB and GRUB 2, of course. But what does a bootloader actually do? In the Linux sense, for GRUB and GRUB 2, what happens is the bootloader is in two pieces. First, the BIOS loads the first stage, which we can see here is a very small amount of data, only 512 bytes. But that's enough information to get the second stage loaded, which actually loads the kernel and begins to load the operating system into memory. Now, when this bootloader is installed, it coordinates all of these actions for the two different stages and begins the process of trying to get the root file system mounted. Now, as you'll see on the right side here, we have several different choices for bootloaders. For the purposes of the exam, GRUB and GRUB 2 are the main ones that you should be aware of. But there's also the legacy loader of Lilo. There's even eLilo, which is for UEFI systems. Slightly different hardware characteristics are available there. And then System Commander and SysLinux. And there's probably a handful of others that might also exist, but these are some of the main ones that you would expect to encounter. Now, if we look at some of the steps for configuring GRUB, now GRUB is no longer supported. You can't even get the files from repositories. There might be some websites that still have a legacy repository. So you should know a couple of details about installing this. And we see the basic steps here. So you can investigate this /boot/GRUB menu. And that will show you some of the configuration options if you had GRUB installed. Or underneath /boot GRUB, we have the grub.conf file. And you'll see that there's a lot of similarity with the previous version of GRUB and the new version as far as the file naming and so on. And then we can simply just run the grub install command for the drive in question, typically dev sda SCSI disk A. So because this is no longer supported, there's probably not much need for using GRUB any longer, since GRUB 2 is the better replacement. It's been redesigned, and the install and update process is very similar. In this case, the configuration file is boot grub2 grub.config, and the first partition number changes from 0 to 1. Minor differences, really. You can also select from multiple kernels using GRUB 2, just like you can with regular GRUB. And the config files can be edited manually, and then we can see how some changes we would make there can be exported to a new config file so that you can reboot and see those changes in effect for your system. Now, Grub Legacy has some command options for how you want the menu to look, how you want it to operate. For instance, you can specify a title for different kernels that you've configured. This could be handy instead of trying to scrutinize some small difference in the configuration of the kernel. The numeric portion of the name. Why not give it a label or a title to make it easier to figure out which one it is that you want to select? You can also pick your own customized image during the boot process. You can even set a password to protect the Grub menu, protect the booting process. That's pretty good if you want to tighten security, and you probably can find some procedures to do that if you're more interested in the security aspect of controlling a system. But as we saw on the previous screen, the install command is very simple and straightforward. And then we can just run the grub make config command, as we see here, to generate the new config file. And once that config file is created, we can go look at it and see what changes are evident. But focusing for a moment more on Grub 2, we're going to go through the process of looking at the config file here and updating the configuration with some changes that are possible, and then look at the evidence of that update. So I'll go ahead and switch. Okay. So first let's look at our config file. And what we can see here, I've actually added a few lines just to show some of the options that you might want to modify. One of the things that people like to change typically is the timeout. 5 seconds is a little bit short, so I'm going to change that to 10 seconds. Now, the Grub default is the kernel that's the last saved version. That's what's specified right now. When you see that default is equal to saved, that's typically what you want, but I can also assign a numeric value like 0 through 5 or whatever it is by specifying a number here. So grub default equals 0, grub default equals 1, and so on. And my third option is to actually use a label like new kernel, or when you're making kernel changes, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's always a good idea to label it or make some other kind of notation so that you know this is the new kernel, and then you can easily revert to the previous one if needed for some reason. And then we have the actual command line that's used when the system boots. So it tells our system to automatically save kernel crash information, where my logical volume manager details are, also the fact that I want my system to be booting in quiet mode, which means only show me critical kernel related messages. So those config changes are pretty basic things that you can do. Just going to save that file. And now once I've edited the config file, I want to verify a couple of things before I build a new kernel. One is I want to look at my grub config file. Or I'm sorry, not the config file, but the device map. And I want to make sure that it points to the correct disk. So as we can see here, grub is now configured well, it was already configured, but I'm just verifying it's configured for dev SCSI disk A. That's what I want. Now I can run the install command on that disk. And it finished with no errors, so that's good. And lastly, I can update my config file. So now I run grub2 make config, specifying the output. And there we go. So now my config file is updated. You can see all the details of that new kernel I just generated. I'm sorry, the new grub config that I just generated. Now I didn't change anything important, but adding changing the menu to 10 seconds, maybe making some other kernels available with the label might be something really useful. Now if I look at Can't type today. I can see that that file has just been updated about a minute ago. So very easy to deal with. And once we're done with that, we may want to also think a little bit about how the bootloader interaction works. And I'll demonstrate this here in a moment. Since I changed the menu, I want to be able to reboot and see those changes. But once I'm in that menu, I've got my 10 seconds to interact with the screen. I can use my arrow keys, or I can click in it if it's a virtual machine. And the arrow keys allow you to go up and down and select the kernel that you want to work with. Or I can use E to edit the configuration if I need to make some changes. There's some things you might want to do there for recovery purposes, for instance. And I can get into the command prompt. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So I'm going to do a shutdown -R now. Actually, I'll do this a little bit differently. I'm going to do an init 6. It's an alternate way to reboot. It's good to know all the different options. All right, so now this, you'll notice that the counter, you might not have seen it very quickly, but at the bottom of the menu, you should have seen the counter. It started out at 10 seconds and it starts counting backwards down to 0. So this is the latest kernel I just created. I still have a rescue kernel here. And you'll notice that I can hit E to edit this particular line. And it's a very simple editor, kind of like Notepad. You just move your cursor around with your arrow keys and make your appropriate changes. So I see some insert kernel module commands here. There's also the line that shows the actual kernel being loaded. So there's Linux 16 and all of the different parameters, specifying where root lives, where the crash kernel settings are, and so on. Now I can hit escape to discard my edits, so I don't want to save anything there. And I can also hit C to get my command prompt. And escape gets you back out of the grub shell. Now when I'm in the grub shell, I've got a lot of different options here. I just typed help to see what some of the commands are that are available to me. There's quite a few options there. And I can do this for a single command if I want to see how it actually operates. So I can boot my operating system from different images that I might have available. I've got other options to think about here, like making changes to my time and date in case I'm in the mode where that's the most important way for me to do this, or the most safe way to do this. I can also define different kernel settings, different characteristics that I want to use. But just knowing how to get into the shell is the main thing as far as what you're doing with the kernel for the exam purposes. Now, to get out of this menu, I can just hit escape. I can also get a, I can also just hit enter here and go ahead and boot from that kernel. So it's important to play around with the settings. There's a little bit of customization, as we saw, and know how to use the either the legacy command to install the kernel, or install grub rather, or to install grub2. So we saw make config, the install command, and also verify that we can write those changes to an output file, the config file, reboot, and then see that they're actually effective. All right, so that gets us to the end of the Boot Manager section. I'll see you in the next module, 102.3, where we talk about shared libraries. Thank you.